Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll give it just a couple more minutes to let everybody join, and we'll get started right on the hour. All right, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's training. This webinar is part of a three-part series on traumatic stress among refugee children and youth. Today is part 3, responding to abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. This training is presented to you by Switchboard. Switchboard is a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Megan Rafferty. I'm a training officer with Switchboard, specializing in mental health and wellness, and I will be your facilitator for today. We're also joined by my colleague, Selena Mate, who's behind the scenes assisting with technology and logistics. Okay, so here's a quick overview of our settings in Zoom. This is a Zoom webinar, so you're joining us in listen-only mode. Due to the large number of learners on today's webinar, we have disabled the chat box. However, you do have the option to send messages to the speaker and facilitators via the Q&A. Keep an eye on the chat for messages from Switchboard and links to various resources that we'll mention throughout. Today's webinar will run for 90 minutes and is being recorded. You will receive an email with the recording, slides, and recommended resources within 24 hours. The webinar transcript, along with the recording, will also be posted on the Switchboard website within the following days. We also want to provide a content warning for today's webinar. This webinar contains content that may be distressing or triggering to some individuals, including but not limited to discussions of child sexual abuse, trafficking, and other sensitive topics. Please practice self-care and reach out for support if needed throughout the session. Last, we ask that you kindly complete our webinar satisfaction survey at the conclusion of our session. This short 3-question survey helps us here at Switchboard to continuously improve our training and technical assistance offerings to you all. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jordan Greenbaum. Dr. Greenbaum is a retired child abuse physician living in Atlanta, Georgia, who has worked in the field of child maltreatment for over 20 years. She's the former medical director of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children and past medical director of the Stephanie Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She is a board member of the International Society on the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect and a past president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Dr. Greenbaum has provided training and technical assistance to health professionals globally to improve the health sector response to child abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. She has also provided training and technical assistance to other child-serving professionals regarding the trauma-informed, rights-based approach to interacting with children and families who have experienced trauma related to sexual, physical, or community violence, as well as forced migration. And now I give it over to you, Dr. Jordan.
Thank you so very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is, as Megan mentioned, this is the third webinar, and so we'll be harking back to some materials from the first two, but really focusing on abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, so that I'm hoping at the end of this session you'll feel comfortable defining child abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and be familiar with some of the risk factors that are sort of general risk factors, as well as those that are particular to newcomer children and youth, are particularly important, and that you'll be able to describe some screening strategies and possible indicators of child abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and then apply skills to engage and empower children, youth, and caregivers, with an emphasis on providing resources and safety planning and kind of working with the child and with the family to be as much help as you can. So next slide, please. So let's begin with, how do we recognize abuse, exploitation, and trafficking? Next slide. This is kind of a busy slide. We're not going to spend a lot of time on definitions because I know that they can be really boring. Actually, definitions can be boring. But I do want to sort of start out with some basics. Sexual abuse, as you probably are familiar with, the WHO particularly stresses that it involves any sexual activity in a child less than 18 that they don't fully comprehend, or they can't consent to because they don't understand, or they're not conscious, for example, or that violates laws or broad social taboos. And I'm not referring to sort of, taboos among very small groups of people, but just general social taboos. Physical abuse is probably the vaguest definition globally and within countries and states. It just is not very well defined, but basically it comes down to non-accidental physical injury. So that implies some sort of an intent to harm a child, or so a threat or actual harm to a child. Emotional abuse involves failure to provide supportive, developmentally appropriate environments in such a way that it really has a negative impact on the child's sense of self-worth. Typically, when we talk about emotional abuse, it's a chronic thing. It's not one single episode where, for example, a child is terrorized one time or belittled one time, but it's a chronic thing where the child is constantly terrorized, belittled, shamed, for example. That would be more what we're thinking about in emotional abuse. And then finally, neglect, another very broadly sort of vaguely defined entity. Typically at the country and the state level and child protective services level, it tends to be defined in a very sort of punitive way that focuses on a failure of a caregiver to provide for the needs of the child. I think we're more and more turning to a much more helpful, broader definition of neglect that uses a socioecological model and just says neglect occurs when a child's basic needs are not met. And that may be because of a failure on the part of the caregiver, an intentional failure. It may be something that they can't control, or they can control if they had the right resources, or it may be something completely outside the caregiver's realm. It's a societal problem. Lack of access to medical care, for example. It may be a community issue, or something within a family or a peer group, something that is at various levels that prevents the child from getting their basic needs met. And it's using that approach that really enables us to think big about how we can address a child's basic needs, and takes us away from the sort of punitive caregiver, you're a bad person type of attitude. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to talk about human trafficking, and we'll find that in the United States, as you may well know, federal law recognizes essentially two types of trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Let's go to the next slide, please. And by federal law, and again, state laws can vary a little bit, but they're based on federal law. There are three components to the definition of human trafficking: an action, a means, and a purpose. And you need to have elements of each to qualify as human trafficking, with a single proviso we'll get to in a minute. But you need to say, if you want to say this person has been trafficked, you need to show that at least one action has occurred. And it doesn't have to be all of them, but at least one action in the left-hand column includes, for example, that a person is recruited, or they're harbored, or they're transported. They do not have to be transported. That's one option. So there has to be an action. And then there has to be a means, which is very simple in the US federal definition. Means includes force, fraud, or coercion. Now, the fraud, the coercion can be very subtle. For example, coercion may be withholding somebody's passport and their visa, and therefore keeping them from having access to their own identification documents, which is a very powerful way of coercing somebody to do what you want, because you are essentially got their vital documents. So it can be more or less obvious, but there has to be a means. And then the purpose is for exploitation. And as I mentioned before, this boils down to commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor or slavery-like conditions. If you look at international law, that includes organ removal as well. By US federal law, they don't yet recognize organ removal as part of human trafficking. Now there is, as I mentioned, there is a proviso. Next slide, please. When we're talking about child sex trafficking, that is commercial sexual exploitation of a person less than 18 years of age, we do not have to show force, fraud, or coercion. Means becomes irrelevant, because a child cannot legally consent to commercial sexual exploitation until they're 18 years of age. And that is different than consent to have sex. State laws define the ability for an adolescent to consent to sex as maybe 16 years old or 15 or whatever it is, but that's different. Commercial sex is exchanging sex for something of value, and you're not able to legally consent to that until you're 18 years of age. So you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion when we're talking about child sex trafficking. Keep in mind, it's almost always there if we look for it, but we don't have to show that. And another thing to keep in mind is this is specific to children involved in sex trafficking. Child labor trafficking does require force, fraud, or coercion, because in the United States, children can work for, they are able to work in the labor sector. So there does require force, fraud, or coercion to show that a child's being labor trafficked. Very confusing, but just keep that in mind. Another thing I want to mention that's really important is that trafficking is not the same as smuggling, and they're often used interchangeably when really they're very different things. Smuggling can turn into trafficking, but it's inherently a different type of activity. Smuggling involves essentially a crime against a country, because it involves illegally transporting somebody across an international border. So by definition, it involves transport, and it involves an international border. And so you're breaking the law by bringing somebody over from one country to the next. It is typically a business transaction. If somebody says, I need to get from Nepal to India, for example, and I don't have a visa, so I need to go illegally, I'm going to pay the smuggler a certain amount of money to get me across the border. I pay the money, they get me across the border, we go our separate ways. End of business transaction. It's typically a voluntary thing. This is what I want. I engage in this because I need to get across the border. And as I mentioned, once the payment has been made, person's gotten across the border, that's the end of that relationship. Very different from trafficking, which involves a crime against a person because you're exploiting a person. It does not require transport, and certainly not transport across an international border. That may be part of it, but it's not required. It's not inherently part of trafficking. And typically trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion, or commercial sex of a child younger than 18. So it's not a voluntary business transaction. And with trafficking, it's not a closed, limited relationship where you do what you promised, I do what I promised, and we go our separate ways. Trafficking goes on for as long as the trafficker deems it in their best interest to do so, or until something else intervenes. But it's an indefinite exploitation. The relationship continues. Now, smuggling can turn into trafficking because that can be part of the deception. For example, a person may say, I need to get from Guatemala into the United States. And so they pay a smuggler to get them across the border. That's a business transaction, but it turns into trafficking if they get across the border and then the person who is the smuggler says, oh no, you owe me more money than you paid before. You actually owe me twice that. And you don't have the money right now? Well, then you work for me until you can pay it off. And you're going to work in a brothel, or you're going to work in agriculture for me until I say you've paid it off. Smuggling has suddenly become trafficking. And that's not an unusual way of recruiting people into trafficking, is pretending you're a smuggler, but actually you're going to traffic them when you get to the next country. Next slide, please. Now, it's very difficult sometimes to understand the difference between labor exploitation and labor trafficking. The difference, of course, is that in one instance, labor exploitation, there's not necessarily force, fraud, or coercion. To be trafficking, you have to demonstrate force or fraud or coercion. Well, that can be very complicated. And frankly, that's above my pay grade and beyond my IQ level. I have a very hard time deciding whether somebody has been experiencing exploitation or whether it crosses the border into trafficking. It can be very subtle. And so fortunately for you and for me, there are these things called lawyers in the world, and they are trained to make that determination, or at least some of them are. So you and I, unless you're a lawyer, don't necessarily need to know whether a person has been exploited or trafficked or both. We just need to recognize whether a person may have been exploited, and then be able to refer them to somebody who can take that next step, ask the right questions, and determine whether legally they've been trafficked or not. And that is an important distinction because there are federal benefits associated with trafficking victimization. So it is important to determine, has a person been exploited? Have they been trafficked? One or the other, both. But it's not necessarily something that you and I need to determine. The important thing for us is to say, is there concern that this person has been exploited, maybe trafficked as well, but at least exploited? And if so, how can I help? What referrals can I make? And how can I get that person in touch with somebody who can make that determination and move forward? So these are, you can see that in the slide, there's a spectrum of activities that can be exploitative and that gradually become more severe and then cross the line to become trafficking once you involve force or fraud or coercion, intimidation, control, threatened violence, for example. That crosses the line. Whereas denying somebody pay or withholding pay or not paying the minimum wage are exploitative practices, but not in and of themselves trafficking. Next slide, please. Let's move on to talk about online child sexual exploitation. You probably heard a lot about this now because people are getting more and more concerned about it. It's really reaching public awareness, not simply the concerns by child protection professionals, but now the public is worried about it too. And there are various kinds of online child sexual exploitation that we need to be concerned about. And these include some of the following, what we call sexual solicitation online, which is like online grooming. It's very much the same as offline grooming of children for sexual abuse, but it occurs online. And it involves sexually explicit conversations with children or youth that may or may not proceed to actually meeting that child offline and having sexual contact with them. So we could spend a whole lecture on that, but that is online sexual solicitation. Another one is collecting, sharing, producing child sexual abuse images, what we used to call child pornography. That term is falling out of favor for good reason. So you're going to see that less and less, and instead in its place, You'll see a term called child sexual abuse materials, CSAM, CSAM. And that is the same thing, but it's a more appropriate way of defining what's happening. And it essentially involves producing, sharing, viewing sexual material, sexualized materials, videos, photographs, etc., of children. And that can be obviously online. People will take photos, do videos, and then share them online. So that's another form of online exploitation. A third one would be sort of building relationships for future face-to-face meetings and victimization. And that kind of goes back to the first bullet, where you groom the child with the intent to engage them either in online sexual activities, for example, sharing sexual photos of themselves, or masturbating online, doing some online sexual activities, or face-to-face meetings and victimization. So that can include online live web streaming of sexual acts, for example, is included as well. And then finally, sextortion, which is blackmailing somebody by sort of encouraging them, pressuring them, getting them to send a sexual image of themselves, that is perhaps their breasts or their penis or their, their a nude picture of themselves to somebody. And then that person who receives that blackmails the person to get more. They say, now I've got this picture of your breasts. I can put this on the internet unless you send me more photos, or unless you send me a video, or unless you send me money, for example. So that's sextortion, blackmailing somebody using an image or sexual materials that the victim has sent them. Next slide, please. Now, we're here to talk about newcomers and their vulnerability to abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. And just by virtue of being children, they are at increased risk for all of these things. But there are some risk factors that children and adults as newcomers face that might make them more vulnerable. For example, many newcomers face a lack of resources. They may have poverty may be very prominent in their lives. They've left everything at home, or they didn't have anything at home. They've come to the United States. They are feeling very financially stressed. And their community may have very few resources, and that makes them at risk because they have very few options. If they're desperate for money, they don't have a safety net in their community, that sort of opens the door for traffickers and exploiters to come in and offer some solutions. If the family is feeling very isolated, or the child is feeling very isolated, that opens the door for people to make promises, to reach out to them, try to fulfill some of that emotional need in ways that can be nefarious and exploitative. So societal marginalization, xenophobia, for example, can limit the resources of newcomers. And so they don't have the options that US-born citizens have. They're more vulnerable. Prior trauma experiences, many people who are new to the country have experienced quite a lot of trauma before and during their migration, and the fact that they have been traumatized and victimized before renders them at risk for future victimization. People who are unfamiliar with the US laws, culture, language, they don't have the access to the resources. They don't know what's normal, what's not, what's legal, what's not. And so they are not in the position to be able to know necessarily whether they're being exploited. And I think this is particularly relevant when they take jobs. They don't realize that there are labor laws that prevent this kind of labor exploitation. They don't realize that. They may think this is normal US working conditions. So they're vulnerable. And then cultural views and practices also may or may not make them more vulnerable. It may make them stronger, but it also may make them more vulnerable. Next slide, please. So let's move to our case scenario, and we're going to follow Sophia throughout this 90 minutes. So you're going to get to know her. She's a 15-year-old girl from Ukraine, and she came to the United States with her mother and her younger 6-year-old brother about a year ago now. And Sophia says that her mother is very sad, very depressed, and very withdrawn. She's not interacting with her kids. She sleeps a lot. She doesn't She seems very distant when she's awake. She doesn't interact with her children very much. She's clearly very troubled and very depressed. And she's been very frustrated because she hasn't been able to get a job yet. So that adds to her depression, making it even harder to get up in the morning. So she's not able to support her family. She's very distressed. Sophia, in turn, is spending more and more time away from home, and she's looking for ways to earn money, and she's seeking social support. She's not getting the family support that she once had. She's looking elsewhere. And so she's looking to other people, peers, other adults, to get support. She's recently started spending a few days at a time away from home, whereas she used to spend afternoons and evenings away from home and come home later. Now she's staying out overnight, even 2 or 3 nights, and her mother doesn't seem to notice. So you're concerned about Sophia's safety and possible sexual or labor exploitation. Why are you concerned? Next slide, please. Megan, can you introduce us to Slido?
Yes, you bet. So we want to hear from you. We want to hear your answer to this question. And so to do this, we're going to use an interactive tool called Slido. You can join today's Slido session in 2 ways. You can either scan that QR code that we've got there on the screen with the camera of your mobile device, or you can go to slido.com in any web browser and you can enter the code 4076913. When we're done with this Slido, we're going to have several more throughout this webinar, so just keep that screen open throughout this 90 minutes and it'll automatically progress to the next questions as we go along. And I'm seeing some answers coming in, so I'm going to hand it back over to you, Jordan.
You guys are rock stars. So the question is, what are Sophia's risk factors for either sex or labor exploitation? And you are already writing as fast as you can, typing with those fingers. Thank you. This is great. This is so good. Needs money. She's a refugee. Sources, depression, potential for blackmail, poverty, lack of supervision. Yes. She doesn't have somebody who she knows is caring about her and saying, where have you been? I need you to be home, giving structure, giving support. She's feeling isolated. Boy, she sure is. She doesn't have the people at home. She doesn't have her family. She is probably not getting a lot of support from her 6-year-old brother. There's a mountain of developmental difference between the two. No family support. She wants to fit in. Yes, she's a newcomer. She's sad. Okay, a lot of these things. These all render her very vulnerable to any kind of exploitation, be it sexual or labor. And as we know, sexual exploitation is a form of labor exploitation. It's labor. If she's going to be sexually exploited and sex trafficked. So yes, she's got all of these risk factors that we need to keep in mind. So thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about screening strategies. How would you know whether Sophia is being abused, exploited, or trafficked? Next slide, please. One of the things to keep in mind is what our role is as service providers. You as a case manager, me as a child abuse physician, all of us who are working with children, what are our roles? We have several. We are mandated reporters if we have a reasonable suspicion to believe that a child may be experiencing or have experienced or be threatened with abuse or exploitation or sex trafficking. We need to report to authorities. So we're mandated reporters, but even more important, we're supporters. We need to be there for children who are experiencing trauma, who may have been abused or at risk of abuse, et cetera. We need to support them and connect them with resources. Those are 3 major roles for us. We're not investigators. We don't have that little sheriff's badge and we don't pack a gun. We are providers, not investigators. And so we need to keep that in mind. And that's going to really influence the kinds of questions we ask, how we screen, what we do. Next slide, please. Oh, I think I meant to talk earlier about that. Let's go back to the last slide. So if we're going to screen, we need to make sure that we are not asking questions and screening to determine whether a person definitely has been a victim of abuse, neglect, trafficking or exploitation. We need to think about whether they think about their risk factors and look at the possibilities so that we can offer resources, not so we can conduct an investigation. Okay, I've made my point. I'll get off my soapbox. Let's go on to the next slide. How would you know whether somebody is potentially a victim of abuse or neglect or trafficking? Well, these are just a few, and I really want to emphasize these are a few potential indicators, which you may or may not see. And so for physical abuse, you may have unexplained injuries that the child or the caregiver is not able to adequately explain, or they give you an explanation that doesn't make any sense to you, or injuries that may have a pattern. They literally have some sort of a shape to them that looks like the object that was used to inflict them. So they look like a slap mark, for example, or they have a loop to them that looks like they've been hit with a folded extension cord. Now, you're not going to see a lot of this because typically children are going to come to you fully clothed, but in some cases you can. For example, if you have a small child who's running around and their shirt slips up on the back and you see a lot of bruising on their back, or somebody's wearing a short sleeve shirt and you see a cluster of bruises on the upper arm, for example, that look like grip marks. So you may see injuries. Somebody has a black eye, or they're wearing glasses inside, and you think that there may be a black eye there. You may see injuries that are suspicious. Difficulty walking or sitting may reflect an injury, of significant injury. Frankly, I haven't seen that a whole lot, but you may. There may be other things like a person is complaining of pain. They're always complaining of pain that doesn't seem to have any physical cause. So it's psychosomatic complaints. A lot of non-specific potential indicators of trauma of some sort, not necessarily abuse or neglect, but sort of non-specific stressors, traumatic stress responses, nightmares, regressive behavior, for example, a lot of new onset behavior changes, withdrawn behavior, aggressive behavior, new changes in the way a child is using the internet. They get very angry or anxious when they get texts, for example, may suggest that they are being harassed online. New friends that perhaps are sort of high-risk friends that have a lot of high-risk behaviors. A child running away from home may indicate that there's something going on at home, may or may not be related to abuse, for example. Age-inappropriate sexualized behavior. Now that's a tricky one because that may suggest that the child themselves have been experiencing sexual abuse, although the majority of children who have experienced sexual abuse do not go on to exhibit inappropriate sexual behavior. And many people who have problematic sexual behavior have a history of other kinds of trauma not related to sexual abuse, for example, physical abuse or neglect. So a person who is exhibiting inappropriate problematic sexual behavior may have experienced any kind of trauma, and it's worth finding out more about what might be going on at home or elsewhere, but not necessarily sexual abuse. For possible indicators of neglect, you may notice unaddressed chronic medical problems, for example. They don't have their medications. They're constantly coming in. You see them and their eczema is really, really bad and doesn't seem to be treated. They're left home alone for extended periods in an age-inappropriate way. They may be often very hungry, complain that they haven't had any food. That kind of thing may suggest neglect. So these are various potential indicators. And probably the best would be self-report. Children may confide in you and say, yeah, I haven't eaten for 2 days. Or Sophia may say, you know, my mother won't come out of her bedroom and I haven't seen her for 3 days. So there may be self-reports. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to get into cultural issues here. And this is a really important, potentially rich discussion. How can you tell when something you see, either a behavior or a physical finding that you see on a child, is related to cultural practice or, say, physical abuse? Let's hone in on physical abuse. How might you determine whether something's cultural or something that you need to report as physical abuse? What are your ideas on this? You need to learn about the culture. You betcha, you betcha. Knowledge is power. Knowledge of different cultures, asking questions. The only way we're going to find out is if we ask. And listening, asking. Your gut will tell you. It may. We always got to listen to our gut. Whether we act on it or not is something else. But we need to look at it. Ask people from that cultural background. That's a good one, because I have had the experience, and you might as well, that a person may attribute something is actually physical abuse. They may say, oh, that's just part of my culture. Whereas if you ask other people from that culture, they'll say, that's not it at all. That's not something that's cultural. So yeah, we need to find out from others who are experts on that culture. Ask in different ways, the client's body language. Ask your interpreter. Interpreters are gold mine of information. That's a really good point. Markets larger than a dollar bill. That's an interesting one. Screening and asking questions about their culture. Oh my goodness, you guys are amazing. This is, I can't even keep up with all this. This is really good. Not making assumptions, ask and listen. Yes. See if the child is trying to hide it. Yep. Persistent bruises. That's a good one. Okay, let's go on and talk more about this. You are so right. I think we're about, yeah, there you go. You are so right. You brought up a lot of really important issues. In order for us to know what is abuse and what is a cultural practice, I think the most important things are what you've just talked about. Listen, learn, ask. Be non-judgmental. Just say, I noticed these marks on your arm. Can you tell me about what they are and tell me about them? And then the child will say, oh, this is a ritual. When I hit puberty, this is what I got. This is what we do at home. And it's a ritual. It's a big ceremony. So you can find out about it. Asking, listening, and with an open mind is absolutely critical. Asking the child about it, asking the caregiver about it, asking other people who are outside this family group, but who are experts on that culture can really be enlightening, or reading about it can be helpful. So listening and learning, figuring out, was this something that was painful or not for the child? Was it something the child didn't want? Getting more information. And I want to just talk a little bit about some things that are often come up in the world of child protection issues. There are certain cultural practices that are practiced for medicinal, sort of health-related purposes. For example, coining. I don't know how many of you have heard of coining. This is a practice where, and it's used in a lot of different cultures, where people will take something like a coin or something sort of fairly small-edged, and rub it very vigorously on different parts of a person's body. And they typically have different lines. They look like lines, and they're parallel lines, and they may be in different parts of the body, and they are geared towards addressing certain health issues. So if a child, for example, has asthma, you may see bruising in parallel lines, kind of in a triangular shape on their chest or on their back if it's something else. Or there may be marks on their hand that represent different you're targeting different health problems. And so it actually will leave bruises, and that can be easily interpreted as abuse, because they're bruises, they persist, and they're patterned. And so people have mistaken those for abuse. And so it's very important to be able to recognize that and ask more questions about that. And it's interesting, because when I would talk with medical students about different cultural practices and the confusion with physical abuse, sometimes those medical students would say, oh, I had that when I was a kid. Yeah, my mom did that. Doesn't hurt. Coining doesn't hurt. It looks terrible, but it doesn't hurt. I don't know if it helped at all. I was too young to remember whether it helps or not, but I know it didn't hurt. And so finding out about that is very, very, very helpful. Moxibustion's another one. Cupping is another one, where they use sort of suction techniques to sort of draw out the harmful, vapors or whatever is causing the illness, and that leaves a bruising too as well. So finding out about it can be very helpful. And then determining, how the child feels about it, whether it's harming the child or not. And then you can begin to have discussions on what it means to the parent, what it means to the child. If it is causing harm, are there ways that you can modify it that doesn't cause harm, so that you can the practice can be observed without harming the child. So you're sort of working around it. Now let's move on to physical discipline versus physical abuse. This is tough. Could we go back to the last slide? It's tough because in the United States, as you know, physical corporal punishment is is legal. And so people can use that, use corporal punishment on their children. And it's poorly defined, as we've said. What is physical abuse? It's often very vague by state law. And so there's tremendous variation about what Child Protective Services and law enforcement will interpret as physical abuse. What you and I may think is physical abuse may not be considered physical abuse by authorities. And there is no really hard line between what's abuse and what is corporal punishment and what is abuse. And so that makes it even harder to work with families who are using corporal punishment, especially if they're from different countries. So that's a new culture to them, vague laws, it's very hard. But what you can do is explain the situation to the parent. And I would, again, be very open-minded and wanting to hear about ways that parents choose to discipline their children. Again, not saying, do you beat your child? But instead say, you know, all children are going to make mistakes. And so we need to discipline them when they do something that is going to harm themselves or somebody else. And so we need to discipline them throughout childhood and help them to understand what's right. What happens when a child does something that you think is wrong? How do you deal with that? And so then you're sort of opening the door to have a conversation and making it very broad so that you're very non-judgmental. Then they say, well, I beat them and I use caning. That's what we do. And then you find out more about that. Under what conditions do you use caning? And tell me what caning means and who, and you know, what are your goals? What do you want from that? And what is your long-term goal with the relationship with your child? And is caning helping you to get there? You're asking, you're open-minded, and then you can sort of use motivational interviewing techniques to move beyond that and say, well, are there any downsides to corporal punishment or to caning your child? Are there any things that you don't like about it? And is it successful? You know, and then you might go on to say, you know, some people tell me, and I hear from other families that when they cane their child, they have concerns about it because they're afraid that their child is learning how to continue the bad behavior but not get caught. And so the caning is actually not teaching them not to do it. It's just teaching them how to avoid detection. And it is making their relationship not one of child to parent respect, but fear of the parent. And so those are some of the concerns they had. Do you ever worry about those things? So you're sort of introducing perhaps some negative aspects of using corporal punishment. And then you can move on from there and see if they are, you know, how they feel about that. And would they be interested in learning alternative techniques to corporal punishment? And often parents are. And then you can sort of move into positive parenting techniques that avoid corporal punishment. So there are ways that you can kind of discuss physical discipline. Also, including in your discussion that clarification of what the laws are and that corporal punishment, while legal, can easily move into physical abuse, which is against the law and can get you into trouble with authorities. It can also, corporal punishment can also easily move into extreme violence that leads to harm. And so you risk significant harm to the child. So having this sort of open, non-judgmental conversation where you are exploring the pros and cons of corporal punishment and sort of moving them towards positive parenting can be very helpful. Next slide, please. Now we talked a little bit about screening. I want to move on to a little bit more about this. Most of the time, you're not going to have access to validated tools that are going to tell you, to screen for physical abuse, to screen for sexual abuse, screen for human trafficking. There are some screening tools available, but they may or may not be applicable to the newcomer population. And so you may not have access, but that's okay. You can still screen for risk factors. Again, we're not screening in order to identify and conclusively demonstrate that a child has been exposed to abuse, neglect, exploitation, trafficking. We're looking for children who may be at risk, and then we can decide what resources may be available to decrease that risk and decide whether we need to make a mandatory report. So the screening we do is screening for risk factors. And you can do that even if you don't have a screening tool available. For example, you can just ask and find out whether Sophia has the risk factors of social isolation, for example, community resources. Is there risk factors in the home, maternal depression, maternal drug use, caregiver mental health issues, for example. Those kinds of things are risk factors. We can screen for those in our general way of having a conversation with the child. You can screen for risk factors, and then you can decide, do I have reasonable concern? Do I need to make a mandatory report? Whether I do or not, what kind of resources can I offer this child and this family? So the goal of screening is to identify risk and needs, not to decide definitively whether somebody is the victim of a crime. And keep in mind that the child and the caregiver may disclose information either directly or indirectly. So using your skills to observe, you can get a lot out of nonverbal body language. You can sort of read into some of the things that the child is saying, so read between the lines to gain information. And keep in mind as well that your concerns and your assessment of risk should be repeated periodically, because risk factors, vulnerability is a dynamic thing. The child may not be at risk now, but she may be, or he may be at risk a month from now. The vulnerabilities can change, protective factors can be stronger or less strong over time. So we need to keep an eye out and repeat the screening. In many times, screening is one way of assessing risk, but another thing that you can do to help protect families and children is to provide universal education. And that is, instead of explicitly screening this child, this caregiver for risk factors, you can provide information which helps to provide resources that may address any vulnerability without necessarily asking about vulnerabilities. And an example of this might be to give some information on work-related labor laws and labor rights and child labor laws. It can be information that is very helpful for caregiver and child, so they know what their basic rights are. And they are more aware of exploitative conditions when they see them. Or you may want to talk about healthy relationships as a way of sort of boosting the protective factors that can protect against sexual exploitation and other things like sexual assault. Next slide, please. Let's go back to Sophia. Remember, Sophia has a very depressed mother and is spending more time on the street looking for ways to earn money and seeking social support. Next slide, please. Here's another question for you. What screening questions might you ask Sophia to help identify, and I would say instead of exploitation, the risk of exploitation? What are risk factors? How can you ask her about that? Hopefully using open-ended questions that invite free narrative. Remember our trauma-informed care last time, open-ended questions are best. How can I help? Yep, she's disclosed to you some of the issues, so broad, how can I help? What type of work are you looking for? I like that, I like that. What kind of work are you looking for? How are things going at home? That's a great open-ended question. And that's going to give you mega information if she's willing to help you and willing to tell you. And you can follow that up with, tell me more. Tell me more about things at home with your mother. Tell me more about things at home with your brother. How do you feel about life here with your family? Who are you spending time with? Do you feel safe? These are really good things. How's school going? And that gives you a sense of how isolated she might be at school. How are you doing? What are your goals? Tell me about your week. I like that. Tell me about the things you've been doing this last week, or take me through a typical day. We're here to support you. What would an ideal situation look like? Do you have friends? Tell me about do you have friends? Yes, I have friends. Tell me about your friends. How is America? How can you describe how you're feeling? You know, I was just reading a great article that is talking about interviewing children, and you can get a lot of information from a child just by saying, how are you feeling? Or how are you feeling about this? How are you feeling about that? And that it is kind of an open door question. I like these. And these are things that are open-ended that are going to get at some of these risk factors. And you can follow up. School's not so good. You say, how is school? Not so good. Tell me about school. Well, I just don't have any friends. Tell me about not having friends. Tell me more about that. Can you explain that a little bit more? And then you're getting at, well, I'm bullied. I'm sorry to hear that. Tell me more about that. And that's then you're getting, okay, there's a risk factor: social isolation, bullying, trauma, these are risk factors. And then you might say, well, how are you dealing with that? How are you dealing with the bullying at school? Well, I leave home, I'm out at night, I seek other friends. Tell me more about the other friends. So you're getting all this information. This is great. You guys are rock stars. Let's move on. So these are just impossible questions, and we've covered some of these. Tell me about a typical day. What's your life like at school? Are you doing any work to pay off a debt? You said you were looking for work. What, have you found anything? Have you found work? Yeah, I have. I did a little, but I wasn't working anymore. Tell me more about that work, because that may be giving you information about how she found work, what kind of work she found. Was it exploitative? How did she decide to accept that work? How was she approached? These are all risk factors you can get at. Has anyone asked you or pressured you to do something you didn't want to do, either at work, online, or otherwise? Good question. This gets at potential sexual exploitation, potential online harassment and sexual grooming, potential sextortion, potential labor trafficking, labor exploitation. Great question. And she can say no. She can say yes, no. And then she says, yeah, this yes, no question. Yes. Okay, tell me more about it. Great. Elvira has raised her hand. Megan, what do I do? Because I don't think we can unmute.
Yeah, I don't think that we're able to do that, but if you can write your question in the chat, then hopefully we'll be able to address it in the Q&A section.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can we go to the next slide? Okay, practical skills. Now, suppose you've identified somebody and you are concerned that this person is being abused, neglected, trafficked, exploited. How do you do this? Let's move on. Well, remember that trauma-informed approach we were talking about last time? Here it is again. Here it is. It's always there. It's like a Visa card in your back pocket. So we want to keep that in mind. You use this trauma-informed approach. Whatever we do, whatever she says, whatever she discloses or doesn't disclose, we respond in a caring, non-judgmental, open manner. We don't show shock. We don't show anger. We don't show horror. We don't show any kind of blaming or maybe doubting. None of those things. Open, caring, accepting, accept her point of view. We recognize and acknowledge her courage in dealing with whatever it is she's dealt with. And if she's disclosed something, yes, I was sexually assaulted. And one of those nights I spent out on the street, I was sexually assaulted. We have to call attention, because she may not be focusing on it, but at some point emphasize her courage in surviving that, her courage in talking about it, and encouraging dealing with it in the aftermath. So she may not be focusing on her own courage. And so it is helpful for us to sort of draw attention to that as appropriate. You're going to work that into the conversation as appropriate. But it helps for her to say, oh yeah, I guess I am more, I had forgotten that I have that strength in me. It's really important to explain the limits of confidentiality. And so if she comes out with something and you weren't prepared for it, you're not going to be able to say, you're going to say immediately, about the limits of confidentiality. You can't prepare for that. But if before you start talking about sensitive things, you prepare your conversation, say, look, we're going to be talking as always, like whenever we're talking, I just want to remind you, as I always do, then anything we talk about, I'm going to try to keep confidential, but if you tell me something that makes me concerned about yours or someone else's safety, I'm going to need to share that information with other people so they can help me to help you. And I've talked to a lot of teachers about this, and they say, you know what? I have in my office, or a counselor will say, I have in my office a big sign on my wall saying, this is confidential, but if you tell me, and they spell out the limits of confidentiality, so it's right there on the wall. And it's always there. So the child is forewarned, because we don't want to sort of spring this on them and then have them feel betrayed. So it's important that before you start your sensitive information, your sensitive conversation, you sort of forewarn them. And then they can choose what they want to disclose. Now, if before you can say anything, they blurt out, I've been sexually assaulted, it's too late. But it's really important that if you have to make a mandatory report, for a child being abused, assaulted, and sex trafficked, et cetera, that you tell them ahead of time before you make that report. Transparency is key, as we've talked about, so that they don't feel betrayed by you. And you have to explain why it's necessary. If they are upset and they don't want you to report, we need to explore their concerns. We still have to make the report, but we need to explore their concerns and try to address them. And they may be extremely important concerns regarding their safety, and that may really influence how we decide to proceed to ensure their safety. So explain the limits of confidentiality, why reporting is necessary. We need to ask about their concerns if they're concerned about reporting, talk about their reluctance, and potential safety issues. We need to listen more than we talk. As we explore sensitive issues, keep in mind, I need to hear. I need to ask open-ended questions so that they can provide information and share what they feel. Don't listen to me. I need to listen to them. We need to avoid making promises we can't keep. I'm so glad you told me. We're going to help you now. This will never happen again. That's a promise you can never keep. So try to avoid that at all costs. We can say, I want to help you. I'm going to do everything I can to help you. But we should not say, this will never happen again. You're safe now, because I can't guarantee that. What else haven't I covered here? I think we've talked about all of these things, and these are things that we've talked about before, just as reminders. They become excruciatingly important when we're talking about a child that's talked about abuse, neglect, trafficking, et cetera, because confidentiality is extremely important, and a child may be experiencing a lot of anxiety and distress. So it's a trauma-informed approach is very, very important. Next slide. Reporting, big one, something we all dread. So it's important to know your state laws around mandatory reporting. Universally in all 50 states, we're required to report. If you're a mandated reporter, you're required to report suspected abuse, neglect, sex trafficking. You don't have to be certain. You need to have a reasonable suspicion. And in some states, there are mandatory reporting laws regarding inflicted trauma of adults onto adults as well, so adult victims. So know your reporting laws. If the situation is life-threatening, call 911 immediately. It's really important, if you are working within your organization, that you follow your organizational protocol, notify your supervisor, and follow your organizational policies. However, that does not necessarily get you off the hook. You are still responsible as a mandated reporter for having that report made. And the person above you, your supervisor, should not, under any circumstances, stand in your way because you're a mandated reporter. But it's really important that you follow the organizational procedures, keeping in mind that ultimately you are responsible for having the report being made, whether it's a report made by you or somebody else. Document it in the case file. You're going to want to say, this is these are the questions I asked. If you can remember verbatim what you asked, great. If you can remember verbatim what the child or the caregiver told you, great. Put those in quotes. Many people can't remember verbatim, that's okay. But we want to make it as accurate as possible, remain as objective as possible. So we don't want to pepper your documentation with interpretation. The child was extremely distraught when she told me. That's very interpretive. Instead, say the child cried or something. That's objective. I can see that. That's how I know the child was distraught. I'm going to describe what I saw, what I heard. Make it objective. Include only what you're able to really testify in court to later. So you want to keep it very objective and very accurate, and document it in a secure record. And consider the implications of telling a caregiver that you made the report. We want to be transparent with the caregiver. If we can, they're going to find out eventually, but we need to consider the consequences of that and look out for the child's best interest, their safety. So that always comes first. Next slide. Okay, one more. I think we only have one more of these. When should you do safety planning with children and youth? Under what conditions should you do safety planning? You're probably familiar with safety plans. So when do you think about them? In emergency situations? Yep. When the child is being abused, the child is afraid at home, anytime, really, yes. When they're in immediate and clear danger, when you know there's abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or if you suspect it. Crisis intervention after a crisis event, yes. Every time, yes. After, yes, it's no abuse. Okay, service enrollment, we learn there are problems, yes. All of these things, exactly. Emergencies, yes. Good. Okay, let's go on. Thank you. These are great. This is exactly what we were talking about. So potentially we do safety planning specifically in situations where there's high risk. So some of these may be, for example, if you have a concern that there is ongoing abuse, neglect, trafficking, exploitation, et cetera. There's some sort of event that there may be the potential for harm. Either it's ongoing or the person is about to leave it, for example, a person who's going to leave an interpersonal violence situation. That's often the most dangerous time when they leave that situation. If they're thinking about leaving it, if they are in a position where they cannot leave it, it's ongoing. How are you going to keep them safe? That's prime time safety planning. Other types of situations may be if they're still in contact with somebody who is an unsafe person, or any stage where they may be in the middle, about to make a change in their situation, which may introduce some risk. These are times when you would want to think about safety planning. And we consider safety plans that are very broad. They're going to be physical and emotional safety we're looking at, and they're going to be both proactive and reactive. So we want to think proactively in terms of how can we prevent these very unsafe events, and how we can recognize when they're on the horizon, when they're about to get there, and what can we do to protect ourselves, as well as what can we do when it actually happens. So proactive and reactive. And the proactive is going to be looking at, recognizing some warning signs, perhaps triggers, things coming down the pike in the environment, things that people say, people do, conditions where you can recognize this is about to turn bad. Recognize that situation so you can respond to it. Maybe proactively calling on some protective factors, things that really work for you to help you sort of gird yourself for difficult situations. That is, reaching out to other people, for example, or relying on some of your own very strong traits or characteristics that help you cope. That you sort of look upon yourself, the strengths in yourself, the inner strength that you can call on to sort of protect yourself, and look to others in the environment, family, friends, peers, teachers, faith-based organizations. You can call on those people to help you protect yourself. Often these safety plans may either actively involve in the production of the safety plan, or at least get them involved in carrying out the safety plan. Other people, for example, caregivers, and as I mentioned, teachers, mentors, peers, even faith-based organizations. These people may actually be helping you to create the safety plan, or be actively involved as implementers in the safety plan. As we know, there's an awful lot of support that children can rely on to help them through difficult times across cultures. When people are asked about what is it that helps you heal from trauma, get through difficult adverse circumstances, and move on, not across cultures, people will say support from other people, family, friends, etc. So as much as we can help a caregiver, help a child, rely on supportive environments, the more that we can help them get through. So bringing into your safety plan support, sources of support is extremely important. So physical safety, where do you go when something bad happens? Who do you call? How do you exit a bad situation? If the child is living in a situation of interpersonal violence, how do you recognize when it's going to come? It happens on Friday night when the father comes home, he's drunk and he picks a fight with the mother, and there's violence. So how can you see this is coming? It's Friday night dinner time. We hear the car rolling in. We know this is coming. Where are you going to go? What's the child going to do? Can they leave the house and go to somebody else's house? Stay out of harm's way. Who are you going to call? If the situation escalates and the father is in, the violence is happening, what can you do to exit that situation? What are some emotional safety signs, warning signs, internal warning signs? You're getting anxious. You're feeling triggered by something in the environment. You know how to respond to that. How do you recognize that and respond to it? What are some coping skills? You can't get out of harm's way. You can hide in a closet. How can you bring yourself down and soothe yourself? How can you do muscle relaxation exercises, deep breathing, yoga, meditate, whatever it is, use soothing strategies. Thinking about being on a treasure island can take you away from a difficult situation. How can you soothe yourselves? How can you look to other people? Can you go inside a closet away from the violence going on in other parts of the home? Can you call a friend? Can you call somebody who can help support you during this time of difficulty? So safety planning looks to those types of plans, concrete plans. If you have a safety plan, you should write it down, have it available for the child, for the caregiver in language that they can understand, developmentally appropriate, in the native language that they can understand. Keep a copy for documentation records as well. Next slide, please. Okay, what strategies can we use for planning for the young children? Now let's talk about younger children. What are you going to do with a young child? Say somebody who's 5 or 6. How are we going to safety plan with them? Think about their developmental stage. What can you not do? Would you plan them at all, or just talk with their caregivers? What would you do if there's a young child in the home? Role play, good. Oh, that's a good one. Make a game. I like that. I like that. Role play, use visuals, self-soothing, age-appropriate strategies, develop code words. Love that. Kids like codes. That's good. Involve an older sibling. Yes, somebody they trust. Try to make it a game. Lots of people saying that. Teach them what constitutes an emergency, how to dial 911, drawing situations. What's a situation where you are strong and you're getting yourself out of a situation? What is a situation where you would need to call on others? Educate. Whether you're using a game, singing, learning songs, reading a book, using visuals, but you're educating them. I love it. Okay, let's move on. For time's sake, let's move on. So just a couple of ideas, and you've hit on these for children, young children, memorizing things. What's 911? Let's figure out how to dial 911. And you're not going to want to actually have them call 911, but you can practice not actually putting through that phone call 911. What is that? If you're scared, what do? Pick up the phone, call 911. Talk to a safe adult. Who's a safe adult? Somebody who's not only your mother or your father, who's somebody else. If mother's not available, who else can you call? If you have access to a phone, plug in that number. How do you access that safety phone? Identify a safe location to go. If your parents are fighting in the room, where can you go? You can go to the closet, you can go to the basement, you can go someplace safe. What can you do? You can call your safety trusted person when you're in the closet, and you can have them on the phone, they can help you. What can you do? Where is your address? What is your address? You get lost, you get taken away by somebody, tell them your address. Tell them your phone number. So these are basic things children can do. Code words is another, I love that one. For older children, you can be a little bit more advanced and look at harm reduction strategies. For Sophia, if she's going to be out on the streets at night, how can she keep herself safe? What are some harm reduction strategies? If you're going to look for work, how can you recognize a high-risk situation? Those kinds of things are safety planning with reasonable, age-appropriate, safe harm reduction strategies. Next slide, please. Making referrals, it really helps if you have your own list of community resources. Again, as with all trauma-informed care, you're going to want to ask the child or the caregiver what they think would be good referrals, what they know about referrals, what they think is an ideal situation, what they want. And then you can say, I have some ideas. Can I share them with you? Yes, no. If yes, then you share your list of community resources and you ask them what they think about that. If they say, yes, I'm interested in this, an intimate partner violence support group, great. Make a warm handoff if you can. And that means help connect your client with that referral source before they leave your office. So you call up that referral agency and you say, you know, here I have a client, and can we make an appointment for them? And so that they know it's a warm handoff, essentially. And I think I'm being told that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to take this, Megan, hand it over to you. Because I just lost her.
No, sorry, sorry, Dr. Jordan. That was me on the presentation. I went to go and get the links so I could drop those and lost.
Oh, no worries. Oh, I'm glad I haven't done a mortal sin or something. But I am pretty far in, and I just I think that's just about it. Was it just the last slide or so, Megan?
Yeah, I'm gonna navigate to those real quick. Sorry, everyone.
I think it's pretty much at the end.
Yeah, we're pretty close to wrapping up.
Yeah. Yeah, making referrals and then getting consent. Yeah. And this is finally the last. If you have concerns about human trafficking, this is a very good resource, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, 24/7 options. If you have a client and they want to speak to a counselor about their concerns about trafficking or exploitation, they have interpreters in 200 languages. And so they can talk to your client if the client wants to and answer some of their questions. You can talk to them as well and give an anonymous tip saying, you know, I'm not going to say who it is, but I have a concern about trafficking or whatever, and give some information. You can also gain resources from them. So keep this in mind. And then I believe the next slide is sort of wrapping up. Let's keep going. Why don't we? Yeah, there we go. Let's go on, because I think we actually covered the last what we would ask Sophia. Let's open it up for questions, and I'm going to hand it back to Megan.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Jordan. So yeah, we've been getting a lot of great questions coming in throughout. So let's get started with this question here. What advice do you have for a case manager who's working with a client who's over the age of 18, who was trafficked and keeps getting into similar relationships?
Okay, I would get down. They're over 18 now. Were they, if they were trafficked as a child, were they trafficked in the United States? Let's say they were not. Let's say they were trafficked back home. So I would give, and they're an adult now, I would definitely give them resources. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center can be a source of resources. I would talk to them about it, offer resources that sort of address some of those issues that may be ongoing vulnerabilities. I would explore, when you say they keep getting into similar relationships, I would explore that. And so it sort of help them explore their own reasons for getting into relationships that might ultimately be exploitative. Are there ways that they can sort of address that and maybe see that coming and do something different? I would provide support and reference resources for peer group support and other types of informational support, healthy relationships. You didn't mention whether it was labor or sex trafficking. I sort of assumed it was sex trafficking, but if it was labor trafficking, I would definitely get them information about labor laws, what is legal and not their legal rights, labor rights, and put them in touch with an organization that might be able to address potential exploitative conditions that might be going on now or in the future. Arming them with information is going to be key, so that they can recognize high risk situations that they may be in the middle of now or down the line. I hope I've addressed that question.
I think so. Yeah, thank you so much. So we've had several questions coming in around what do you do or how do you address cultural practices that are both physical abuse and a cultural practice? And so one example that came up might be of female genital cutting. So what do you do?
Yeah, female genital cutting is a whole issue in and of itself. That's, you know, illegal, and it's got so there's a lot of issues with that, because it's not only a sort of a cultural thing, and I understand that it is a cultural thing, but it has a lot of health implications. That is not allowed in the United States, and so it is really an important issue too. That's a lecture unto itself. But it's very important to make that clear to people if they come from a culture where female genital mutilation is considered appropriate. It's really important to make that clear that that's not acceptable here in the United States. It's not legal, it's not acceptable. And so we need to sort of work through that. Caning would be another example where it is culturally considered appropriate, and yet it would be considered physical abuse. And that is sort of what I was getting at before, where you use a combination of motivational interviewing to sort of make them sort of understand why they are using that particular thing, what it means to them, and if they are open to other forms of discipline, bringing in, discussing the pros and the cons. And that's when you bring in, oh, by the way, it's illegal here. And it would be a source of a referral to Child Protective Services. So that is a definite con of continuing to do that here in the United States. It's not allowed here in the United States. So that would be something that needs to be brought in. And then you would try to work with the parent and say, knowing that I can't stop you from caning your child, but it's got that consequence of being a reportable physical abuse and being reported to authorities. And can we work on some other way of dealing with that? And that's where the motivational interviewing comes in.
Yes, great. So if it's reportable, we still have to make a report, even if it's also cultural, and letting the families know in advance, and letting them know that some of these practices are illegal here. Yeah.
And then I'd also say is, when you call Child Protective Services, say, I am working on this as well, that this is, that these parents are new, they're bringing in a cultural thing. I'm working on it. And so hopefully Child Protective Services won't go to the extreme unless the child's in real danger. I mean, if they've broken a leg or something, you are going to want them to act very, very quickly, but you want the Child Protective Services to see this within a cultural context as well, so that they can respond appropriately.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So here's a tricky one, Jordan. So how would you respond, or how would you support in a situation where there are Afghan girls who are sexploited, but they're afraid to tell their parents about it because it might lead to violence from parents, or maybe some other issues that might come up in the family if the parents learn about this, and so they're scared to tell anybody. What might you do in that situation?
Are they being sexploited then? Are they being sexually exploited by somebody else? Then they've sort of disclosed that, or they're being pressured to? We're not sure.
There's not a lot of details, but just maybe a situation where maybe a teen is having an experience at school or outside that the parents don't know about, but they're scared to tell their parents about it because they're scared of how the parents might view them.
This is really tricky because let's come with an example. Let's say that, I think this was another question. Girls are getting a lot of pressure from peers to have oral sexual contact with boys who, let's say, let's make that, let me see. Let's make this. I'm trying to think of an example that would be a good example. Well, let's not have an example. I think that the issues here are that we need to discuss with the child, be very openly, so you can understand more about what is going on. So as much as the child is able to share with you, then you can really understand, has something occurred? Is it going to occur? Is it against, what is going on? Is it against the law? Do I need to make a report? So you sort of have to assess the situation. And if you're going to need to make a report, you're going to need to make that report, and the parents are going to find out about it. So we need to be very cognizant. Let's say you have to make a report. It's a mandated report. And so I would say to the child, I would explain to the child why I need to make the report, and say, your parents are going to find out about this because the police are they're going to find out. And so how are we going to deal with this? We need to make sure that we minimize any negative consequences from that from that report. So that would entail talking to the child about what she thinks or he thinks the parents are going to do, and how we can take measures to avoid that, and how you can work with authorities saying this is a real risk safety issue. You can't go in here just with any other case and go blindering through, because this child is going to be really at risk of repercussions from our family. So how are we going to handle this in a way that's going to protect the safety of the child? So we have to make that front and center of any response. Again, if you have to make a mandated referral, you're going to have to make that referral, but you can, to a certain extent, help to control how that referral comes back to the family and what is done, and look to protect the child. And that means not just immediate protection, but ongoing protection. How are you going to have a safety plan? Essentially, that's where the safety plan comes in. Megan, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just important to talk to the teenager about, I have to make this report and what's going to happen afterwards, and just try to give them as much information as possible. And then talking with them about, how can we, tell your parents together? How can I support you in telling your parents? And like you said, the safety plan, and making a plan for all these future actions. Yeah. All right, let's see. So we have another question about, it's about reporting, really. So does survivor choice in moving forward after a sexual assault, so it's a one-time incident, it happened, does the minor still have survivor choice about whether or not to make a report?
We're mandated reporters for the minor, but the minor has a say in whether they want a police investigation going on. So we have, it's like, I have to make the report, and the police are going to get involved, but the child and the family can say, I don't want to press any charge. I mean, they can respond to their own interaction with the police the way they want. So the mandated report is just in notifying the police, but the child still has some control. And then I would also emphasize the child has control over that report, in as much as they can be involved in helping you make the report, or they can have you make the report. You give them choice there. Do you want to be in the room while I make the report? Yeah. Do you want to help me make it or not?
Yeah, great. And another one here. So what advice would you give to case managers who deal with situations similar to Sophia's with her mother? So when the mother is sort of disinterested, or maybe I might say she's otherwise preoccupied, she probably has a lot going on in her life as a newcomer, and she doesn't have as much time maybe to be monitoring the teen's activities. How would you address this issue with the caregiver? Or what advice do you have for case managers that would be working with the mother?
Again, I can't give specific advice, but in this type of thing, I think the mother would require intensive services. And then at the same time, I would work to try to get people from family or the community or the school to help take up some of that slack. So is it possible that, and I'm just throwing out ideas here, Sophia could be involved in some sort of after school care program, or is there something that the faith community that they're involved in could help out? Is there a mentor who could be involved? Is there somebody who could be watching the 6-year-old in the afternoons, maybe an auntie or somebody else in the community? Can other people take up the slack and sort of it takes a community? They're sort of helping the mother care for her children, and they could also help the mother care for herself. Perhaps they could be supportive of her as well, bring her into a peer group or something to help her get out of bed and share how she's feeling with other people who are going through the same thing. So I think looking to others to help take up that slack is going to be critical.
Yeah, great. And I think it's also a great idea to consider, other community resources for the teen, like after school programs, mentorship programs, all those types of things. Where can we get this youth support after school, maybe until mom or caregiver is more available?
Yeah,
great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just go with, I think we've got about one more and then we'll move on. But what can we do to prevent traumatic stress among refugees, or what can we do to prevent some of these situations from happening?
I think a lot that we can do is provide psychoeducation about how it's normal to have these, feelings and behaviors that the various traumatic responses to stress, that those are normal and that they will get better. Their normal responses to abnormal situations, they expect to get better. If they don't get better, there's help. And there are ways that you can help them to learn how to sort of control their own anxieties and soothe themselves, and that they can learn to identify triggers that make them anxious and take measures to sort of calm themselves down. The more that we can help them understand what they're going through, they've already gone through this trauma, they're responding to it now. How can we help them understand that and soothe themselves and sort of help themselves, the better able they'll be able to deal with future trauma. And the more that we can encourage them to identify and use other social supports, family, peers, educators, teachers, case managers, faith-based leaders, other people, the more that they can sort of get the strength from others to help them through these things. And that makes them stronger, so that they can deal with subsequent traumas that come their way, and even try to move beyond them and become even stronger. And it also helps if we can educate them about potential abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. So they recognize high-risk situations, they recognize common recruitment strategies for trafficking and exploitation, and they know how to respond. And that gets into role playing. If you are online and somebody wants you to send a sexual photograph of them, how would you get out of that? If you feel yourself gut saying, ooh, that's weird, pay attention to that gut. How would you get yourself out of that and decline to do it? So that you're equipping them with tools that can prevent them from getting into these situations, or allowing people to move in on them and exploit them.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you so much to everyone who asked all these great questions. We're going to go ahead and just start closing out for today. So we'll start by reviewing our learning objectives. We hope we were able to meet the learning objectives we set for you in the beginning. We hope that you're now able to define child abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, recognizing risk factors for newcomer children and youth, that you can describe screening strategies and indicators of child abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, and that you're comfortable applying practical skills to engage and empower children, youth, and caregivers, with that emphasis on safety planning and providing service referrals. All right, and so we do have some helpful resources that we'd love to give to you all to continue your learning journey, but we'll start with the survey. So can we put that survey back up on the screen there? There we go. So this is extremely important and helpful for us in improving our future trainings. We take your feedback very seriously. It's just about 30 seconds. So if you want to take out your mobile device, you can pull up your camera and scan the QR code on the screen. I know we've also put the link in the chat for you. You can click on that, and we'll even give you about 10 more seconds right now, just to give you a little bit of quiet time to get that pulled up and maybe even get it started or finished. So.
And I can't tell you how much this is really important to me. I incorporate changes constantly. So thank you for any feedback.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you to those of you who got that open, to those of you who've already completed it. The survey will remain open, and we'll send the link out again tomorrow in our follow-up email for those who weren't able to complete it today. But yes, just like Jordan said, we look at this, we share this feedback with all of our speakers, and we do our best to incorporate and make changes. All right. So here are our recommended resources for you all to continue your learning journey. We'll pop some of these links in the chat for you, but there's an awful lot. So you're going to get a copy of this slide deck, and all these links are going to be in here ready for you. So we hope that you will download the slide deck, take a closer look at all these recommended resources that we've got. Okay, and we've also included some client-facing resources. So including that National Human Trafficking Hotline that Jordan already discussed, and a few other resources that can be really helpful with doing some of that psychoeducation for children and youth for prevention. All right, and finally, please stay connected with us. You can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. You can reach out to us via email anytime, or you can visit our website where you can find our extensive resource library, including recordings of all of our past webinars. You can find information about upcoming webinars and get registered for those, or you can submit a technical assistance request for additional support as needed. So we want to give a big thank you to our audience today. Thank you so much for your engagement and your thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes, to our wonderful speaker, Dr. Jordan Greenbaum, as well as my colleagues behind the scene. A lot of effort goes into making these webinars. So thanks to everybody who makes it possible. All right, have a great day.